As You Trot by Laura Dahl, illustrated by Quentin Blake. Mr. Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He had always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in summer the little balcony became a riot of color. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr. Hoppy jutted out a good bit further from the building than his own, so Mr. Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an attractive middle-aged lady called Mrs. Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who also lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love. He had loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was a very shy man, and he had never been able to bring himself to give her even the smallest hint of his love. Every morning, Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver exchanged a polite conversation, the one looking down from above, the other looking up, but that was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but to Mr. Hoppy it seemed like a million miles. He longed to invite Mrs. Silver up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him. As I said, he was a very, very shy man. Oh, if only, he kept telling himself, if only he could do something tremendous like saving a life or rescuing from a gang of armed thugs. If only he could perform some great feat that would make him a hero in her eyes. If only. The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all her love to somebody else, and that somebody was a small tourist called Elfie. Every day, when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments to Elfie and stroking his shell, he felt absurdly jealous. He wouldn't even have minded becoming a tourist himself if it meant Mrs. Silver stroking his shell each morning and whispering endearments to him. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on her balcony summer and winter. Planks had been placed around the sides of the balcony so that Alfie could walk about without toppling over the edge. And in one corner there was a little house into which Alfie would crawl every night to keep warm. When the when the colder weather came along in November, Mr. Silver Mrs. Silver would fill Alfie's house with dry hay, and the tourist would crawl in there and bury himself deep under the hay and go to sleep for month on end, and without food or water. This is called hibernating. In early spring, when Alfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony, and Mrs. Silver would clap her hands with joy and cry out, "Welcome back, my darling one! Oh, how I have missed you!" It was at times like these that Mr. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with Alfie and become a tourist. Now we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail, watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast. "Here's the heart of the lettuce for you, my lovely," she was saying, "and here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crisp celery." "Good morning, Mrs. Silver," Mr. Hoppy said. "Alfie's looking well this morning." "Isn't he gorgeous?" Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. "Absolutely gorgeous," Mr. Hoppy said, not meaning it. And now, as he looked down at Mrs. Silver's smiling face gazing up into his own, he thought for the thousandth time how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love. I do wish he could grow a little faster, Mrs. Silver was saying. Every spring, when he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales. And do you know that in all the 11 years I've had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces? That's almost nothing. What does he weigh now? Mr. Hoppy asked her. Just 13 ounces, Mrs. Silver answered. About as much as a grapefruit. Yes, well, horses are very slow growers, Mr. Hoppy said solemnly, but they can live for 100 years. I know that, Mrs. Silver said, but I do so wish he would grow just a little bit bigger. He's such a tiny wee fellow. He seems just fine as he is, Mr. Hoppy said. No, he's not just fine, Mrs. Silver cried. Try to think how miserable it must make him feel to be so teachy. Everyone wants to grow up. You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you? Mr. Hoppy said, and even as he said it, his mind suddenly went click and an amazing idea came rushing into his mind. Oh, of course I would, Mrs. Silver cried. I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant horses that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy. Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here, surely, was his big chance. Grab it, he told himself. Grab it quick. Mrs. Silver, he said, I do actually happen to know how to make horses grow faster, if that's really what you want. You do? She cried. Oh, please tell me. Am I feeding him the wrong things? I worked in North Africa once, Mr. Hoppy said. That's where all these horses in England come from. And a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret. Tell me, cried Mrs. Silver. I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy. I'll be your slave for life. When he heard the words, your slave for life, a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. Wait there, he said. I'll have to go in and write something down for you. In a couple of minutes, Mr. Hoppy was back on the balcony with a sheet of paper in his hand. I'm going to write it to you on a bit of a string, he said, or it might blow away. Here it comes. Mrs. Silver caught the paper and held it up in front of her. This is what she read. As you trot, tag ragged, amok, no, as you trot, work poop, puff poop, tooth poop, nerves poop, word poop, lurves poop, agrogs, elzook, fat, pluck, top no, tough, as you trot, top no, tough, techno, elbow, joof. What does it mean? She asked. Is it another language? It's Taurus language, Mr. Hoppy said. Tauruses are very backward creatures. Therefore, they can only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious, isn't it? I suppose so, Mrs. Silver said. Bewildered. As you trot is simply Taurus spelled backwards, Mr. Hoppy said. Look at it. So it is, Mrs. Silver said. The other words are spelled backwards too, Mr. Hoppy said. If you turn them round into human language, they simply say, Taurus, get bigger. Come on, Taurus, grow up, puff up, shoot up, spring up, blow up, swell up. gorge, guzzle, stuff, gurp. Put on fat, tourists, put on fat. Get on, gobble food. Mrs. Silver examined the magic words on the paper more closely. I guess you're right, she said. How clever, but there's an awful lot of poos in it. Are they something special? Poo is a very strong word in any language, Mr. Hoppy said, especially with the horses. Now, what you have to do, Mrs. Silver, is hold Alfie up to your face and whisper these words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Let me hear you practice them. Very slowly and stumbling a little over the strange words, Mrs. Silver read the whole message out loud in Thru's language. Not bad, Mr. Hoppy said, but try to get a little more expression into it when you say it to Alfie. If you do it properly, I'll bet you anything you like that in a few month time he'll be twice as big as he is now. I'll try it, Mrs. Silver said. I'll try anything. Of course I will, but I can't believe it will work. You wait and see, Mr. Hoppy said, smiling at her. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. You're a slave for life, he kept repeating to himself. What bliss! But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. This he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and brought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect his carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them altogether. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his choices. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them very carefully. To you and me, there is not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in the color of their shells. Alfie had a darkish shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker shelled tortoises for his great collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie's 13 ounces, others a great deal more, but he didn't want any that weighed less. Feed them cabbage leaves, the pet shop owner told him. That's all they need. And a bowl of water. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 horses, and he carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips, and he was quite exhausted at the end of it all. But it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it! And what an amazing sight his living room was when they were all in there together. The floor was swarming with the horses of different sizes, some walking slowly about and exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from a big shallow dish. They made just the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet. But that was all. Mr. Hoppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes between this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that. He must get on with the job. Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mate if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a truss. This was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First, he had made 2 metal claws or fingers, and these he attached to an end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down inside the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pull the wires, the claws closed, and when you pushed them, The close opened. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So on that first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony, armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tourist catcher. He leaned over the balcony railing and lowered the pole down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You are about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tourist catcher till it was right above Alfie, pushed the handle level so that the clothes opened wide. Then he lowered the two clothes neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the level. The clothes closed tightly over the shell like two fingers of a hand. He hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tourists to find one that first of all had the same color shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tourist was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice it.